Hi, everyone. So, one of the things that has frankly been an enigma to me is the fact that the left, which presents itself as a political persuasion that is sympathetic to the oppressed, to the underdog, to the minority, has managed to get themselves in a position where they are so hostile to the one and only sovereign Jewish state and also seemingly sympathetic to anti-Semitic people points of view, and it's so odd to me. And I understand that they've managed to create this scenario where Israel is the oppressor versus the oppressed, but it doesn't take that much digging to see the context to Israel's founding, the Jewish people's history, the context in which the geography of the Middle East and what they've been surrounded by, to understand that the Jewish people in many ways are the ones that are being oppressed here. And I don't understand how this has happened. And so Trudy Gold, who featured on JTV a few weeks ago, and it was I saw many comments demanding that she be returned, and I'm so thrilled that Trudy, you've joined us again today. She's a popular Jewish historian based in the UK and also a close friend. And she and I have spoken in the past about the history of how the left have got themselves to this place where you have someone leading the Labour Party just recently, Jeremy Corbin, who basically was hostile to Israel's very existence. And I wanted to invite Trudy on to unpack how this has happened, how the left got themselves to this place, because knowledge is power, and knowing the history can help us get into the root cause of this. So, Trudy, first of all, thank you for coming back on JTV again. I really appreciate it. And what I'd like to do is just invite you to take us on a journey, perhaps over the next half hour, of the origins of the left and how they started their hostility to Jews, and take us up to the present day. And maybe I'll butt in every time I have a question.
It's lovely to be here, Ollie, and thank you so much for inviting me. Well, I think I better start with Karl Marx. Karl Marx, the daddy of them all, was of Jewish birth, but he was converted and, in fact, obviously had no religion. If you remember his great statement, religion is the opium of the masses. And yet, he decided that the Jewish people were a problem in terms of capitalism. And to unpack that, you need to look at Marx himself. Marx was a very alienated character. He was born in the Rhineland. He was the grandson of rabbis on both sides. His uncle was a rabbi. His father was emancipated under Napoleon, which meant he could become a lawyer. But when Napoleon fell, his father had a choice: either go back to the ghetto or remain a lawyer. And he was no longer religious, and he did that, and he converted his son when he was 8. And we presuppose Marx would have been very bullied. And of course, the alienated Marx, he creates a whole new system. Workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. This also coincides with the beginnings of emancipation in Europe. And out of all proportion to their numbers, the Jews had a high visibility profile. It's almost as though these people, with their thirst for knowledge, they're exploding into the West that they adored. And as a result, you had a disproportionate number of Jews who went into areas like banking, department stores, cinema. So there was this image that the Jew somehow was all powerful. The reality was the bulk of Jews at this period lived in Eastern Europe in dirt poverty. But Marx had it into his head. He began to equate Judaism with capitalism. I don't like to use the term Jewish self-hatred, but I do believe he suffered from it. He didn't have any of the benefits of being part of the Jewish world, but he would have been bullied. We know he would have been called a Jew. And as a result of that, he turns a lot of his fury, and he was a most unpleasant man anyway, against the Jewish people. Now, having said that, many of the leaders of the revolutionary parties throughout Europe were of Jewish birth. Now, they break away from their Jewish origins, they're outsiders, and they see injustice. And also, it had to be said, the majority of the Jews were left wing, I would suggest right up until the 70s. Okay, so take the figure of Marx, and then I want you to jump on the communist revolution in Russia And of course, number two to Lenin was Lev Davidovich Bronstein, known as Trotsky. A disproportionate number of the revolutionaries, as I've already said, were Jews. And that led to, ironically, if Marx says all Jews are capitalists, those who hated the left said all Jews were communists. The reality is, I want to stress this, the majority of Jews in the world tended to have left-wing leanings, because I think that's the tradition of social justice. In 1948, actually go back to 1947, when, mainly as a response to the Holocaust, we have to talk a little bit about Zionism now. Now, Zionism as a movement arose in the 19th century amongst Jews who began to realize that something had gone wrong with the emancipation contract. Despite the fact that Jews plunged themselves into modernity, and certainly in the West became very loyal citizens of Britain, France, Germany, whatever, you saw the rise of nationalism, the rise of racism. Consequently, whenever a society is fractured, and the 19th century is a century of such terrible change, and people look for a scapegoat. And ironically, you see the rise of racial anti-Semitism in the best century the Jews had ever experienced so far. So a few individuals, most of whom had believed in the emancipation contract, were totally disillusioned. They also looked at the Jewish past and said, hold on a minute, are we really British, German, French? What does it mean to be a Jew? Is it a national aspiration? So a response to anti-Semitism, pure Jewish nationalism, very much in line with all the other nationalisms of the 19th and early 20th century, plus the connection of the Jews with the land. If you go back through the whole of the diaspora, go back 2,000 years, next week is the Passover. Ollie, tell me, what do we say when we sit round our Seder table? We say next year in Jerusalem. In our prayers, it's there. So consequently, you see the development of the Zionist movement, which was really a minority movement in the Jewish world right up until the Shoah. Yes, there was a Jewish population in Palestine. Yes, young idealists did go out there, but the majority of Jews were either in the East, the religious Jews were awaiting the Messiah, and the Jews of the West had this dream that integration would work, that they could be British Jews, French Jews, German Jews, Polish Jews, etc. And the Shoah, if you think about it, one of the most civilized nations in the world, in inverted commas, certainly one of the best educated, decided that birth was sentence of death. And as a result, you had this long, slow process of mass murder. It was a 4-year process where modern technology and bureaucracy were harnessed to factories of death. Absolutely unparalleled in human history. And at the end of the war, in Europe, the Germans had managed to murder 6 million of the 9 million Jews. What was to happen to them? Many went home. The first instinct of any survivor was, let's go home to see what's happened. And in the fracture of war and the cheapening of life, I don't even know how to say this to you, but thousands of Holocaust survivors were murdered when they tried to go home. Their possessions were taken away, etc. Consequently, it culminates in a little town in southern Poland called Kielce, where there's a blood libel. The old medieval notion that the Jews used the blood of Christian babies for their Passover breads, it's back. So what you have the impetus for after the Shoah was the establishment of the State of Israel. And in the end, the United Nations decided to partition Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. And what is fascinating is that the Russians electrified the General Assembly when they said the Jews are owed a state. And Stalin was one of the main supporters of the establishment of the State of Israel. And it was Stalin who gave both de jure and de facto recognition. So there was even an article in the Daily Worker, so beloved of Jeremy Corbin, saying that who are the Jews, these brave young people, these brave young socialists, bearing in mind that the majority of the settlement in Palestine, the kibbutz, the moshavim, think about it, they were actually socialists. So Stalin backs Israel. Also, if you think about the Arab countries at the time, their majority are feudal, they're feudal monarchies. And in the war, in the Cold War that is emerging, where the two superpowers, Russia and America, are jockeying for power, Stalin believed it was in his interest to back the Jewish state. Because at the very best, he would have an ally. At the very worst, he would have a neutral state in the Middle East. And that's what happened. But then Golda Meir goes to Russia as Israel's first ambassador, and 50,000 young Jews came out to greet her. And that made Stalin realize he still had a Jewish problem, because Judaism was dead in the Soviet Union, as was Christianity. And ironically, it had been Jewish commissars who had broken down Jewish life in Russia. So what was still there? And then you begin to see the change. There are trials in Hungary, and particularly the Slansky trial, where Slansky and who is the deputy head of the state, and many in Czechoslovakia, and many of his colleagues of the 13 put on trial for, this is interesting, Trotskyism, because of course Trotsky's emerged as the great enemy of Stalin, even though he's been already murdered by Stalin in Mexico, Titoism, another enemy of Stalin, rootless cosmopolitanism, and Zionism. And it culminates in the doctor's plot. You begin to see Jews singled out. It's very difficult to get into the mind of a Stalin because he was one of the worst mass murderers in history. He murdered many Jews, but he murdered them along with other sections of the population. But most historians believe he was about to go for pogrom when he died. So important to remember, the change in the Soviet Union happens under Stalin. And meanwhile, things are changing in the Arab world. Some of the monarchies are falling. If you look at Egypt, Nasser is in power, who has a dream of becoming the new Saladin, and he's playing the West off against the East. Ironically, Egypt and Syria are full of Nazis who have come to the Middle East to spew out their terrible propaganda, because obviously the Arab world sees Israel as its enemy. And it must be said, and I think it's come up so strongly in the last few days, Israel was always used as the whipping boy to unite a terribly disunited Arab and Muslim world. And what we're seeing at the moment, which is hopeful, is that there's a slight fracturing. But Nasser, of course, he wants to be the new Saladin. Later on, he creates a union with Syria. What the dream of the Arabs at this stage was Arab nationalism. Get rid of the old colonial powers, the white colonial powers. Now, the Arabs they're using anti-Israel rhetoric already, and it's being enhanced by the Nazis. But then you begin to see rather sinister things happening in the Russian world. Israel does a deal with Germany, the reparations deal. Adenauer, who'd never been a Nazi, the Chancellor of Germany, desperately wanted a reconciliation. He wanted rehabilitation. And in return, he was going to supply Israel with German goods, etc. Huge indemnity. Israel, who saw itself as the heir to the Holocaust. And this is when really serious anti-Semitism begins to appear in the East European press. Think about it. East Germany, West Germany. It's further exacerbated by the trial of Kastner. Kastner was a Hungarian Jew who had tried to save Jews in Hungary, but it was a very complicated situation. Suffice to say that Hungary was not attacked until April 1944, because Hungary was allied to Germany. And then the Germans realized the Hungarians were going to pull out of the alliance. They rolled in. Now, this is an extraordinary fact. Between the end of April, beginning of May 1944, and July 1944, 436,000 Jews were murdered in Auschwitz. Now, Kastner did his best to save, but he did negotiate with the Nazis. And that came up at the trial. And that really, really upset many Israelis. Can you imagine? You're looking for questions. Did Kastner in any way collude? Now, the great historians of Jewish history like Yehuda Bar would say, no, he didn't. He talked to them. But frankly, I talked to the devil if I thought it would save my family. And this is where more and more of this kind of rhetoric is coming out of East Germany, is coming out of East Germany and is coming out of Russia. Of course, Stalin falls, other regimes courting the Arabs, and by 1967, the Arab world is firmly in the Soviet sphere of influence and is being weaponed by the Soviet Union. Israel at that stage was not so close to America. The real ally of Israel was France. So Israel, tiny little Israel, who had had to absorb people from 52 different countries. Remember, there were 9 million Jews in Europe in 39. In 45, there were 3 million. Nearly 1 million of them found homes in Israel. They were absorbed into the population. The Israelis set up Marborot, absorption centers. And nobody really took on at that stage that in the end the Holocaust would be used against the Jews, because what then happens in the communist press, you begin to get the association of the Jews with Nazism, pulling on things like the Kastner affair, pulling on the deal they'd done with West Germany. And also back in 1933, a man called Chaim Lozorov, who was a Jew from Palestine, had negotiated with the head of the Reichsbank to allow German Jews to leave Germany with certain German goods and money. Because remember, up until 1941, Hitler wanted a Judenreich. Again, I would reiterate, I would speak to the devil. Consequently, this is the areas of history that are going to be distorted in Russia. And Russia begins to set up all sorts of institutes, Zionology. And they set up the Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow. And many people from the third world come to study there. And you might be interested to know that Abbas actually took his PhD on the connection between Zionism and Nazism. So, and I can show you hundreds of cartoons, the distortion of the facts. Now, as far as the left is concerned, the extreme left in the West, these ideas have already permeated, but it comes to the crunch in 1967 when Israel won a victory. The victim state, the Jewish victim state, all of a sudden, tiny little Israel manages to survive. There was a wonderful comment by Saul Bellow. You know what he said? He said, if the Israelis had lost, the world would have sent 30,000 blankets to the surviving orphans. You have no idea the kind of rhetoric that the Arabs used. And of course, they've been armed up to the hilt by Russia. And also, after 67, the Jews are seen as winners. And this is where you've got to think about what happens in the 60s. Think student revolution. Think really a complete shift. There's the Vietnam War, there's the Japanese Red Army, there is the Baader-Meinhof group. The PLO is created. It's created in 2 centers, one in Saudi and one in Egypt as rival centers. Nationalist movements which are opposed to the old system of colonies, etc., etc. And do you see how the shift happens? Israel, all of a sudden, is becoming an oppressor, no longer a victim. Israel is now the oppressor. Israel is now the proud possessor of, because what happened in the 6-Day War is Israel conquered the West Bank from Jordan. Now, the Jordanians more or less closed the border. They don't want the refugees. You know, back in 48, they closed off the West. They had closed off those areas. And not only that, Egypt had closed Gaza off. The refugee problem, and of course it's a terrible problem, but for a Jew at that period, when considering Israel had to absorb over 1 million Jewish refugees who were thrown out of the Arab world, I don't think they got it. That was the point. But in 67, Israel becomes more and more associated with the West. And gradually, in this notion of colonialism, is Israel a white colonial nation? Ironically, as you well know, at least 50% of the population of Israel are not white. A lot of them the majority come from the Arab world. And as I said before, and this really must be said, 1 million Jews were expelled from the Arab world, and nobody talks about it. There's no right of return to Iraq or Syria or Egypt. Is there? And this is really, really interesting. So why? And now I'm going to bring in Howard Jacobson. He's a great writer, and he said that they cannot forgive us the Holocaust. There's absolutely no doubt that there was huge guilt when those films were finally shown, which gave people an inkling of what the Shoah had been all about. Remember, there had been an Allied declaration back in December 1942 about the murder of the Jews of Europe. It had been in the press, and I've already given you the figures for Hungary a year and a half later. From the point of view of a Zionist, the world stood by, either was indifferent or colluded in the murder of a third of all Jews. Yes, there were extraordinary people who saved, I'm not saying that. And 35,000 of them are honoured in Yad Vashem. But the majority of them actually let it happen and stood by and colluded. Now, what's that about? And now I have to take you into a world of almost esoteric thought. They can't forgive us the Holocaust. Look, for 2,000 years, the Jews have been the pariahs of Christianity. You know, the notion of the deicide. Now, I'm not mad. I do not go around thinking that every Christian or person of Christian origin thinks that the Jew is guilty of deicide. But what I do think is it's so deep in the culture that once the guilt is no longer with us, we can look at Israel and say, look, you are behaving like Nazis, aren't you? You are oppressing the poor Palestinian people. And that is, in a way, an incredible relief for many in the West.
So it's to wash their hands of the Holocaust, to coin the phrase.
Yes, exactly. Because, look, Hitler, between 33 and 41, was prepared to let Jews out. Yeah, they got out as late as October 1941, even after the invasion of Russia, which is the beginning of the final solution. German and Austrian Jewry could certainly have been saved in its entirety. You should read the press comments in Britain, in France, about the number of Jews coming in, taking over the jobs of other people, etc., etc. Ironically, the German and Austrian Jewish contribution to this country was absolutely unrivaled. But that's another story. But there's guilt on a psychological level, as Howard said, they can't forgive us the Holocaust. And then, of course, tiny little Israel is now a conquering people. And the left, think about it, the campaign for nuclear disarmament, the hatred of America after the Vietnam War, Israel more and more associated with America and seen as a colonial power. And this is where the shift happens, Ollie.
Can I ask, what's the chicken and what's the egg in terms of Israel moving to America versus Soviet Union? Is it that what happened after 1967 and therefore Russia say, this is a problem because we want to be allied with the Arab world?
No, it was earlier. It was earlier.
So,
oh yes, it starts really in the 50s with people like Brezhnev, and they're setting up all these universities. I think Abbas's PhD, for example, on the connection of Zionism with Nazism. They're training future leaders. Look, the West and the East are at war. Okay, they're at war for the souls of the third world, as they called it then. And Russia was very close at that stage to Egypt and to Syria. So it was in their interest. And this is where this pernicious Jew hatred comes from. There were departments at Russian universities, also in Egypt, in Syria, and in Iraq. You have absolutely no idea the horrific level of Jew hatred that came out of these places. And it spews into the left.
Yeah. So let's keep going now into the 60s and onwards.
Oh, well, you see, in the 60s, Israel's already a problem state for the left. But it culminates when, of course, Begin comes to power in 1978. and then the invasion of the Lebanon. And that is when the left really begins to see that Israel is a Nazi state, in inverted commas. So it's the escalating problem, but it goes from the hard left into what I call the soft left and liberalism. Because we, particularly now that we have this sort of intersectional view of the world and politics, where anyone who is third world, anyone who is seen as a victim, you will embrace, but the Jew is no longer a victim. So you can't embrace them anymore. Not on the contrary, the Jew is the arch perpetrator. Little Israel. I mean, I wish they'd look at a map and see the size of Israel. Before 67, if I remember correctly, Ollie, it was 8 miles wide at Tel Aviv. So that's how the whole disease begins. And it spews out and it magnifies. And of course, with the invasion of Lebanon, and you would not believe the kind of propaganda that came out of the Arab world, that came out of the Russian world, and also which comes out of the left in this country. And of course, people like Jeremy Corbyn and Ken Livingstone and that ghastly man whose name I can't even bear to say, George Galloway, they were all trained in that world. They sat at the feet of the Marxists. They went on the CND marches. They were fighting for the oppressed. Well, who were the oppressed? You see, Jews do not make good victims. They did not sit in refugee camps. Now, I'm not in any way saying anything against the ordinary Palestinian folk. On the contrary, I feel incredibly sorry for them. They are the biggest victims of the Arab world. I think they are the victims of the Arab world. I was
They
talking
bear the weight.
to
I think I heard a Saudi, Loe al-Sharif, who's an Arab Muslim peace activist, he said, oh no, it wasn't him, it was Jared Kushner, who said when he was trying to negotiate with the Saudis that one of the top Saudis said, I feel sorry for the Palestinians. They have to bear the weight of the Arab world on their shoulders.
Yeah. I mean, I was talking to a Palestinian friend of mine at the weekend. He said that if they'd fled into Lebanon and gave themselves and were given refugee status, they couldn't get a job. So the Arab world very cynically used them. And you've got to remember the Arab world itself is riven with all sorts of issues. Sunni, Shia, the various factions. Also, of course, those states that, like Saudi, as opposed to what we have now in Iran. They're huge enmity in the Arab world. And Israel is the binder. It's the scapegoat. They take this idea of the scapegoat, which is Jewish, it's biblical, it's Yom Kippur, where all the sins of the tribe are put on the black goat who's sacrificed. Israel is the sacrifice. Israel is the scapegoat. And what is fascinating is how the left has taken it up. And as a result of that, it's also allied with conspiracy theories that go all the way back to the roots of anti-Semitism. I mentioned Marx. All Jews are capitalists, all Jews are communists, all Jews are press barons, all Jews are everything you don't want to be. And that's backed with a huge force. And the irony, in the old days, we knew where the hatred came from. It was the right, the extreme right. Now, in many ways, it's worse coming from the left because many of them do it in a righteous way. All Israelis are this terrible, evil people. I mean, the fact that they boycott Israel as they boycott no other nation, the fact that the left will now march with people who are homophobic, who are against any kind of rights for gays, think about it, and the left will go on marching with them, some of them even supporting Hamas. And one of the things I find absolutely horrifying is that recent survey where a quarter of Muslims interviewed didn't even believe October the 7th happened.
Oh, it was 3/4. It was 3/4.
What? My
it was
God,
3/4. Yeah.
And it's absolutely horrific. It's like the Jew has now been demonized. The Jew who was responsible for killing God, in inverted commas, is now demonized again. When do these things happen? When there's huge fracture in society, when there's economic, social, and political unrest, you find the scapegoat. And unfortunately, in the world of monotheism, we are the perfect scapegoat. And
Trudy, do you
other
think
groups,
that people like Jeremy Corbyn, in their heart of hearts, believe that they are hostile to the Jewish people?
I think, in their, it's very difficult me to deal with it. I think in their heart of hearts, they are not very bright. I don't think Corbyn's very bright. I don't think he's got away from the protest mode. He swallowed the mantra, and like many ideologues, he's got no flexibility of thought. So
Mm.
America evil, Israel evil. The people who come, the third world, good. Israel not third world, bad.
Mm.
Look, you see, I think the problem, there wasn't a positive image of a Jew anywhere in European culture until the 18th century. And then it was written by Lessing, a German playwright, and it fails on the Berlin stage because no one can imagine a Jew as a hero. You know, we have had 2,000 years of theological hatred, which then becomes anti-Semitism. It's a very, I don't, when society is reasonably even, it doesn't come to the fore. But society is terribly broken at the moment, isn't it? And we live in an era of populism. We live in an era of totalitarian ideas. What worries me also about the extreme left is their ideology. I believe that they are fascistic in the way they deal with people. I believe passionately in freedom of thought and freedom of expression. And provided you don't scream fire in a crowded theatre, and provided you don't incite anyone to murder, then I think you have freedom of speech. But the left won't give me freedom of speech, nor will the extreme right.
Mm.
Liberalism is what is threatened. Liberalism is going in the West, and it's tragic.
Mm. Mm.
A close friend of mine, who's a very cynical character, said to me, look, we're living in the decline of the West. It couldn't have been much fun in the decline of the Roman Empire either. What is happening is it's accelerating. And I really believe that many young people who feel disenfranchised, it's very difficult to find your place in the world now. They've sort of opted into this ideology which doesn't require them to think. I've looked at those marches through London, and I want to say very, very carefully, I think the Palestinian people, something must be done about them. But ironically, they are the victims not of the Israelis, they're the victims of the Arab world. Now, of course, with the Israeli incursion, many of them are dying, even though it's very difficult to deal with Hamas. But let's look at that particular case. Hamas is the elected representative of Gaza. Now, how that came to being is another presentation, as you well know. But take that through to the limit. A sovereign state, Gaza, invaded another sovereign state and perpetrated a massacre that hasn't been seen since the Shoah, or even some of the worst massacres of the Cossacks. And it's almost, I know they found copies of Mein Kampf in the tunnels. I'm sure they had studied.
And
Look,
in the homes.
in the homes. And you see, that's
Yeah.
the other point, the propaganda that has been spewed out to the ordinary folk. And remember what Goebbels said. If you tell a lie often enough, people believe it.
Yeah. Trudy, I have a question, which is, do you think people on the left, and let's say even the moderate left, do you think they'll eventually wake up and realize we need to have some kind of a realignment? Do you see that happening, or do you think they'll just literally, because in the end it's self-negating, they'll destroy themselves through this line of thought?
Do I believe that they're going to come to their senses? They're going to, I wish I could. But, you know, ironically, the liberal left are the ones, the useful idiots, as I call them. They're the ones most at risk. The
Yeah.
ideologists and the ideologists are a dangerous bunch. I've never liked anybody who can put a whole pattern to the world. You have to
Mm.
look at every issue. You have to think. And that's what
Mm.
we're not doing anymore. Our
Mm.
education system doesn't teach us to think anymore. It's very, very dangerous. And look, we're also moving into an era of populism. Look at
Yeah.
the look at the choices that are faced by people now. So, in a way, you latch onto a cause, the rights of the oppressed.
Yeah.
One
Yeah.
also has to look at is who, in fact, is oppressed.
Yeah.
I find there's no one ever mentions the million Jews who were thrown out of the Arab world. There were pogroms in the
Yeah.
Arab world. They're not mentioned.
Hmm.
But it's
As far.
so in the end, Ollie, it's good old fashioned Jew hatred in a different
Yeah.
guise. Does Corbin know that he's a Jew hater? He can't even say the word, can he?
Well, if he does, it's and all other forms of racism.
Yeah, what on earth does that mean? All other forms of racism. You know, you have to look at what it means. What is a victim? Does it mean that all victims good? All anyone who is seen as a victim, everything about them must therefore be good? That's what we're seen to be being told at the moment by the left.
Well, as I heard someone say, I don't remember Jewish people, when being liberated from the camps, going and raping German women, beheading German babies. You know, even victims we do apply moral agency to, as we should,
Mm.
right? So
Mm.
why that it's such lazy thinking, and
There's
it's the bigotry of low expectations.
And also that wonderful quote of Adolf Hitler, I can never forgive the Jews for inventing a moral conscience. Of course they didn't, but that's what Hitler thought. And it's something else to bash us with.
Mm.
You see, we have a very strange history of survival against all odds. And as a result of that, we don't fit into anybody's systems.
Yeah,
What is a Jew anyway?
yeah, yeah. And we also,
And
as you said, don't make good victims, because
no,
we don't we refuse to be victims.
no, we've had too much practice of trying to survive, haven't we? For 2,000 years, we've had to survive. So consequently, we don't make good victims. But I do believe at the moment, many Jews in this country are feeling very uneasy.
Mm.
And isn't it ironic? You know, I remember the 60s when the threat came from the extreme right. And I'm not saying we should always be careful of the extreme right. We should also be careful of all extremism. But the real hatred is coming from the left. And what I find really disgusting about it is it's so righteous. Their righteous indignation about evil little Israel.
Mm. Mm.
And that makes me very angry
Yeah,
because it's
and
so. Go on.
absolutely. Well, I also was just going to say that I think the other disturbing thing is I'm seeing it perhaps more in America, but I'm seeing a growing fringe anti-Semitic movement on the right as well. So
Mm.
it's coming at us from different angles as well. And I just thought
Well,
it's worth mentioning that.
oh yes, of course. Look, and as I said before, when society is fractured, you blame the scapegoat, and Jews fit in beautifully to conspiracy theories.
Mm.
Because if you think there are 14 million Jews throughout the world, that's all. And Jews do tend to have high visibility profile in many professions, be that to the left or the right. Jews are individuals, but the conspiracy theory, if there are American Jews who are capitalists working with socialist Jews somewhere else, it's got to be this conspiracy. Oh, everyone understands the Jews rule the world, don't they? Because now this is what you really need to think about and make a huge leap of imagination. Go back to that stereotype that is so deep in Western culture because we killed a god.
Mm.
The irony, the absolute irony, is that Yeshua of Nazareth was a Jew.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
he was crucified by the Romans.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, obviously, the Gospels aren't going to say anything against the Romans because they're writing under the Romans. So let's blame the Jews.
Yeah.
Because the
you're
Jews
right.
did not. You see, that's the problem. When Jesus becomes God. Now, we have to be very careful, as I said before. I do not believe that's at the front of many people's minds, but it's in the culture.
Mm.
And all you have to do is wander around any European city, particularly Catholic countries. Go and look at the image of the Jew.
Well, it's as Dave Rich said, that the word Jew has been used as an insult for
Well, up
centuries.
until 1959, I think in the Oxford Dictionary, to Jew someone meant to trick them, to cheat them. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
yeah, of
yeah.
course. It's in the culture.
Yeah, and I think this point about us not making good victims, I'm reminded of the quote of there's this brilliant academic in America called Thomas Sowell, and he was asked by a senior American Jewish representative, what can we do to combat anti-Semitism as a Jewish community? And he said, fail more.
We're too we're too frightened to fail, aren't we?
Well, yeah, I think that's right, and I think that's a good note to finish this segment on. And we shouldn't be frightened to fail because, as you and I have said over and over again, we've proven ourselves as the eternal nation, and you and I both believe that just as difficult as things may look in the past and at present, we always find a way to come through.
Yeah, sometimes the price is too high, but I believe in the
Yeah,
eternal destiny of the Jewish people. And we are going through an awful time, but I do want to reiterate that as a grandmother, when I see any child or any innocent person being killed, it really gets to my soul. But I really don't know what choices Israel had after that terrible massacre.
yeah,
And that's why, if you're asking me who I blame for what's going on in Gaza, I blame Hamas.
yeah, yeah. And
Where
by the way,
Israel, I'll just say one more thing because I think
mm,
it's important. When rockets are fired at Israel, they have the Iron Dome. The kind of money that Hamas had, they could have protected their people. But instead,
absolutely.
they didn't. They chose to allow them and even to want them to become cannon fodder. And that is unforgivable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's what we saw with Ismail Haniyeh, the head of Hamas, when he was informed last week that his 3 sons and grandchildren were killed. And he just went, okay, and carried on with his walking tour.
Mm.
It's a death cult. And I agree. That reminds me of the Golda Meir line. That it's just unforgivable that they've made us have to do this in response, because we
Mm.
are people who celebrate life and we do not want any suffering, any death of anyone at all. That's not who we are. And
Mm. And
it's
we've got to
important.
remember that. And
Yeah,
also, I think there are many young Jews who have become influenced by the left who don't really understand their own history. And that's
yeah.
something else that needs to be redressed.
Well, that's precisely why we've had this conversation today, and I'm sure we'll do many, many more of these, Trudy. So thank you so much for your time and for your knowledge. And please comment in the video if there's particular topics you'd like Trudy and I to discuss on a future video, and we will endeavour to look at that and consider choosing that as the next one. So thank you, Trudy. Thank you, everyone. And we'll see you next
Thank you,
time.
Ollie.
Hi everybody, thanks for watching. If you want to watch another one, click here. If you want to subscribe to stay up to date with all the latest JTV content, click here. And if you're feeling really keen, you can click the join button down below underneath this video, where you can get perks including early access to new videos and private live discussions with me, where we can talk about JTV content and strategy moving forward, and I'll get to hear from you. Thanks again for watching.